What happened to the wives of Nazi leaders after World War II ended is a question shrouded in curiosity and intrigue.
That women were obsessed with Nazi policy, including Nazi racial policy during the war.
These women, once entwined with some of the most infamous figures in history, faced a tumultuous and often tragic aftermath.
We didn't go in the shelters, we just carried on. We didn't seem to worry much about it.
From public scrutiny to legal battles, their lives took dramatic turns, revealing a side of history that is seldom explored. Let's delve into the immediate aftermath and discover the fates that awaited these women once the war was over. As World War II drew to a close in 1945, the wives of high-ranking Nazi officials found themselves in precarious positions. These women, who had once enjoyed privilege and status, suddenly faced an uncertain and hostile future. The immediate aftermath of the war was marked by a series of arrests and intense interrogations. Many of these women were swiftly detained by Allied forces. The Allies were determined to dismantle the Nazi regime and bring its leaders to justice, and the wives were often seen as extensions of their husband's influence. For example, Magda Goebbels, the wife of Joseph Goebbels, was taken into custody shortly after the fall of Berlin. Similarly, Emmy Goering, the wife of Hermann Goering, was arrested and imprisoned by American forces. These arrests were not just punitive measures. They were also meant to gather intelligence about the inner workings of the Nazi hierarchy. Interrogations were a crucial part of the immediate aftermath. The Allies wanted to extract as much information as possible about the Nazi leadership, war crimes, and any remaining threats. Women like Ilse Hess, wife of Rudolf Hess, were subjected to intense questioning. These interrogations were often grueling, as the Allies sought to understand the extent of the wives' knowledge and involvement in their husbands' activities. The women were asked about everything from their husbands' political strategies to their personal lives, and the information they provided sometimes played a crucial role in the broader denazification process. The public and media were captivated by the fates of these women. Newspapers and radio broadcasts across the Allied nations reported on their arrests and interrogations, with a mix of fascination and revulsion. The wives were often portrayed as complicit in their husbands' crimes, and there was little sympathy for their plight. This public scrutiny added an extra layer of pressure on the women, who were not only dealing with legal consequences, but also the court of public opinion. The immediate aftermath also saw a rapid loss of status and privilege for these women. Properties were confiscated, bank accounts were frozen, and luxurious lifestyles were replaced with the stark realities of imprisonment or house arrest. For instance, Margareta Himmler, wife of Heinrich Himmler, went from being the spouse of one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany to a detainee struggling to provide for her daughter. This sudden shift was a harsh reminder of the transient nature of power and privilege. Not all of the wives faced justice. Some attempted to escape their fates. For example, Magda Goebbels, in a notorious act of loyalty to the Nazi cause, chose to commit suicide along with her husband and their 6 children in Hitler's bunker. Others, like Lena Heydrich, wife of Reinhard Heydrich, fled to remote areas to avoid capture. These attempts to escape the consequences of the war highlighted the desperation and denial that many of these women experienced. Public perception and trials. In the aftermath of World War II, the wives of Nazi leaders faced a harsh and unforgiving public perception. Media outlets across the globe were captivated by these women, portraying them as extensions of their infamous husbands. The public's fascination was mixed with revulsion, as many saw them as complicit in the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime. Newspapers and radio broadcasts sensationalized the lives of these women, often painting them with the same brush as their husbands. For instance, Magda Goebbels was frequently depicted as the First Lady of the Third Reich, a title that carried heavy connotations of her unwavering support for Nazi ideology. The media's portrayal was instrumental in shaping public opinion, leading to widespread condemnation and a lack of sympathy for their post-war plight. The general public's reaction was one of anger and disdain. In Allied countries especially, there was little empathy for the women who had once stood by the side of some of history's most reviled figures. Demonstrations and vocal demands for justice were common, with many calling for severe punishments for these women. This public pressure often influenced the legal proceedings they faced. While many of the top Nazi officials were tried at Nuremberg, their wives were subject to various legal processes. Emmy Goering, for example, was tried by a denazification court. She was convicted and sentenced to 1 year in a labor camp, followed by the confiscation of a significant portion of her property. Similarly, Ilse Hess faced public trials and was interned for several years before being released. These trials were not just about justice, but also about publicly denouncing the remnants of the Nazi regime. The outcomes of these trials varied. Some women, like Emmy Goering, faced relatively light sentences compared to their husbands, primarily due to the lack of direct involvement in war crimes. Others, like Lena Heydrich, managed to escape severe punishment by fleeing to remote locations and avoiding capture. Nonetheless, the trials served as a platform for the Allies to demonstrate their commitment to denazification and justice. Prison sentences and releases. The prison sentences handed down to the wives of Nazi leaders were a direct consequence of their association with the regime. While their husbands faced the gravest of charges, these women were often judged on the extent of their involvement and their knowledge of the atrocities committed. Some wives, like Emmy Goering, received sentences that involved both imprisonment and labor. Goering served a year in a labor camp, which was a stark contrast to her previous life of luxury. Margarete Himmler, although not formally tried, faced internment in Allied camps along with her daughter. These sentences were a mix of punitive and rehabilitative measures aimed at breaking the remnants of Nazi influence. The conditions these women faced in prison were harsh, reflecting the Allies' determination to punish those associated with the Nazi regime. They were often held in basic, uncomfortable facilities with limited access to the outside world. The loss of status and the reality of their new lives as prisoners were stark reminders of the consequences of their associations. Over time, many of these women were released as the immediate post-war fervor subsided. For instance, Ilse Hess was released in the mid-1950s and lived a relatively quiet life thereafter. Emmy Goering, after serving her sentence, also managed to reintegrate into society, though she never regained her former status. Reintegration was challenging, as these women were often shunned by society and had to adapt to lives far removed from their previous privileges. The public reception of these women post-release was mixed. While some managed to lead relatively private lives, others, like Magda Goebbels, whose suicide precluded any post-war life, became symbols of the Nazi regime's fanaticism. Those who did reintegrate often did so under the shadow of their husbands' legacies, facing ongoing public suspicion and scrutiny. Reintegrating into society was fraught with challenges. Many faced economic hardships, social ostracism, and the constant stigma of their association with the Nazi regime. Margarete Himmler, for instance, struggled to find a stable footing, constantly reminded of her husband's role in the Holocaust. These challenges underscored the long-lasting impact of their husband's actions on their lives. Life in exile. For many wives of Nazi leaders, exile became a refuge from the legal consequences and public scrutiny that awaited them in post-war Germany. These women, having lost their privileged status, sought new lives in foreign lands, hoping to escape their pasts and rebuild their futures. One of the most notable destinations for those in exile was South America. Countries like Argentina and Brazil, known for their relatively lenient immigration policies, became havens for many former Nazis and their families. For instance, Gerda Bormann, the wife of Martin Bormann, fled to Argentina with her children. In South America, she lived a relatively quiet life, avoiding the intense scrutiny she would have faced in Europe. Others chose to remain in Europe, but moved to less conspicuous locations. For example, Lena Heydrich, the widow of Reinhard Heydrich, initially fled to Bavaria and later settled in the remote island of Fehmarn. There she lived a secluded life, running a small pension and avoiding public attention. Despite her efforts to remain under the radar, her past inevitably followed her, and she was occasionally subject to investigations and media interest. Life in exile was not easy. These women often had to adapt to new cultures, languages, and social norms. The loss of their previous social standing meant they had to find ways to support themselves and their families, often without the financial resources they once had. Additionally, the psychological toll of exile, combined with the constant fear of discovery and prosecution, made their lives in foreign lands far from idyllic. Many women in exile went to great lengths to remain anonymous. They changed their names, adopted new identities, and severed ties with anyone who might link them to their past. For example, Margarete Speer, the wife of Albert Speer, lived a relatively quiet life in Germany after her husband's imprisonment, distancing herself from his legacy. She maintained a low profile and avoided public discussions about her husband's role in the Nazi regime. The social isolation these women faced was profound. Cut off from their previous social circles and living in constant fear of exposure, they led lives marked by solitude and secrecy. The stigma associated with their husband's actions followed them wherever they went, making it difficult to form new relationships or integrate into new communities. Economic struggles. The end of World War II brought severe economic hardships for the wives of Nazi leaders. Once accustomed to luxury and affluence, these women now face the stark reality of financial instability and the loss of their social standing. One of the immediate consequences was the confiscation of property and assets by the Allied forces. Estates, bank accounts, and other assets were often seized as part of the denazification process. For instance, Emmy Goering, the wife of Hermann Goering, saw much of her property confiscated. This included not only their lavish home, but also valuable art collections and personal belongings. The loss of these assets left many of these women with little to no financial security. Finding a source of income proved to be a formidable challenge. The stigma associated with their names made it difficult for these women to find employment. Margareta Himmler, for example, struggled to support herself and her daughter after her husband's death. The lack of marketable skills and the public's unwillingness to associate with anyone linked to the Nazi regime further compounded their difficulties. The loss of social standing was another significant blow. These women, who once enjoyed privileged positions in society, now found themselves ostracized and shunned. Public assistance was often their only recourse, but even this was fraught with challenges. In many cases, they faced bureaucratic hurdles and societal prejudice, making it difficult to secure the help they needed. An illustrative case is that of Ilse Hess, the wife of Rudolf Hess. After her husband was imprisoned, Ilse faced severe financial difficulties. With limited means to support herself and her family, she relied on the generosity of sympathizers and whatever small income she could generate from writing. Her financial struggles were a stark contrast to her previous life of comfort and influence. Despite these challenges, some women managed to adapt and find ways to survive. For instance, Lena Heydrich turned to running a pension on the island of Fehmarn. While this did not restore her previous lifestyle, it provided a modest means of income and a degree of independence. Similarly, other women took on menial jobs, worked as domestic helpers, or relied on the support of extended family and friends. The long-term economic impact on these women was profound. Many lived out their lives in relative poverty, a far cry from the wealth and influence they once enjoyed. The economic struggles they faced were a constant reminder of the downfall of the Nazi regime and the far-reaching consequences of their associations. Personal relationships and marriages. The aftermath of World War II brought significant changes to the personal lives and relationships of the wives of Nazi leaders. The war's end marked not just a political and social upheaval, but also deeply personal transformations as these women navigated life without their powerful husbands. For many, the end of the war meant the loss of their spouses through death, imprisonment, or execution. This left a void in their lives and fundamentally altered their marital status. For instance, Magda Goebbels chose to end her life along with her husband and children in Hitler's bunker, driven by her loyalty to the Nazi cause. Others, like Emmy Goering, had to cope with the imprisonment and eventual death of their husbands, resulting in both emotional and practical challenges. Some of these women eventually remarried, seeking stability and companionship in their new lives. For example, Ilse Hess, the wife of Rudolf Hess, remained loyal to her husband until his death in Spandau prison, never remarrying and continuing to support him publicly. On the other hand, Lena Heydrich, after fleeing to Bavaria, remarried a Finnish theater director, Mauno Manninen, and lived under her new name in relative obscurity. This remarriage allowed her to carve out a new identity separate from her infamous past. Forming new relationships was fraught with difficulties. The stigma attached to their previous associations with top Nazi officials made it challenging to build trust and intimacy. Potential partners were often wary of the public backlash that could arise from being linked to a former Nazi spouse. Despite these hurdles, some women managed to find partners who accepted them despite their past, although these relationships were often conducted discreetly. Social isolation was a common theme. Many of these women found it difficult to reintegrate into society due to the lingering suspicions and prejudices they faced. Their personal lives were marked by a need for secrecy and caution, affecting their ability to form lasting friendships and maintain social networks. The legacy of their first marriages and the actions of their husbands cast long shadows over their new lives. They often had to navigate the delicate balance of acknowledging their past while attempting to move forward. This balancing act defined their personal relationships and marriages post-war, with many opting to remain single or live in relative anonymity to avoid further complications. Children and family dynamics. The impact of World War II on the children of Nazi leaders was profound, shaping their lives in ways that were both visible and deeply personal. The legacy of their fathers and the social stigma attached to their families created complex family dynamics and significant challenges for these children. The children of Nazi leaders had to grapple with the heavy legacy of their fathers' actions. Many were too young during the war to fully understand their fathers' roles, but grew up under the shadow of their infamous legacies. For instance, Gudrun Himmler, the daughter of Heinrich Himmler, remained a staunch defender of her father, never renouncing his actions and continuing to honor his memory publicly. Her unwavering loyalty highlighted the deep and often unbreakable bonds within these families, despite the horrific actions of their patriarchs. The social stigma attached to being a child of a Nazi leader was immense. These children faced ostracism and bullying in school and their communities. They were often labeled and judged for the sins of their fathers, making it difficult to form friendships and integrate into society. For example, Etta Göring, the daughter of Hermann Göring, lived with the constant burden of her father's legacy, facing prejudice and discrimination throughout her life. The psychological impact on these children was significant. Many experienced feelings of guilt, shame, and confusion as they learned about their father's actions. This internal struggle often led to mental health issues, including depression and anxiety. The need to reconcile their love for their fathers with the reality of their crimes created deep emotional turmoil. Family dynamics were strained by the war's aftermath. The imprisonment or execution of their fathers left many children without a paternal figure, leading to fractured family structures. Mothers often had to take on the dual role of caregiver and provider, which was challenging given the economic and social hardships they faced. The dynamic within the household was one of survival and resilience in the face of adversity. The children of Nazi leaders had to navigate a complex relationship with their personal identities. Some chose to change their names and distance themselves from their past, while others embraced their heritage, for better or worse. For example, Nicholas Frank, the son of Hans Frank, the Governor-General of occupied Poland, became a vocal critic of his father's actions, writing books and giving interviews to condemn the Nazi regime and his father's role in it. The generational impact of being a descendant of a Nazi leader was profound. These children often carried the burden of their father's actions into adulthood, affecting their relationships, careers, and social interactions. The legacy of the Nazi regime continued to shape their lives, influencing how they were perceived by others and how they perceived themselves. Psychological impact. The psychological impact on the wives of Nazi leaders after World War II was profound and multifaceted. The dramatic shift from positions of privilege and influence to lives marked by public scorn, legal repercussions, and personal loss left deep emotional scars. Many of these women likely experienced symptoms of PTSD, the trauma of the war, the sudden loss of their husbands, either through execution, imprisonment, or suicide, and the drastic change in their social and economic status created a perfect storm for PTSD. Symptoms could include flashbacks, severe anxiety, and uncontrollable thoughts about the traumatic events they endured. For example, Lena Heydrich, after the assassination of her husband Reinhard Heydrich and the subsequent Nazi reprisal, lived in constant fear and paranoia, which are classic PTSD symptoms. Depression and anxiety were common mental health issues faced by these women. The isolation, social stigma, and constant public scrutiny took a toll on their mental well-being. Margarete Himmler, the wife of Heinrich Himmler, struggled with depression after her husband's suicide and the loss of their privileged lifestyle. The constant fear of retribution and the guilt by association added layers of anxiety, making it difficult for these women to lead normal lives. Guilt and shame were pervasive feelings among these women. While some maintained loyalty to their husbands' ideologies, others were haunted by the realization of the atrocities committed. Emmy Goering, for instance, had to reconcile her love for Hermann Goering with the reality of his war crimes. This internal conflict often led to profound feelings of guilt and shame, exacerbating their mental health struggles. The social isolation these women faced further compounded their psychological distress. Shunned by former friends and associates, they often led lonely lives. The ostracism extended to their children, creating an environment of shared suffering and isolation. This social rejection could lead to feelings of worthlessness and hopelessness, common in depressive disorders. In an attempt to cope with their psychological distress, some women turned to writing, philanthropy, or other forms of self-expression. Others withdrew from public life entirely, seeking solace in anonymity. However, the persistent mental health issues often remained untreated, as the stigma around mental illness and the lack of available resources during the post-war period made it difficult for them to seek help. Memoirs and public statements. The wives of Nazi leaders have provided valuable insights into their lives through memoirs, interviews, and public statements. These personal accounts offer a glimpse into their perspectives on their husbands' actions and their own experiences during and after the war. Several wives of Nazi leaders wrote memoirs, shedding light on their personal lives and the complexities they faced. One notable example is Emmy Goering's memoir, My Life with Hermann Goering, where she discusses her life with one of the most powerful figures in the Nazi regime. While her memoir tends to portray her husband in a favorable light, it also provides a candid look at the challenges she faced during the war and its aftermath. Interviews with these women have also been revealing. For instance, Margarete Himmler gave several interviews in which she spoke about her husband's role in the Holocaust and her own complicity. These interviews often revealed a mix of denial, justification, and occasional remorse. Ilse Hess, the wife of Rudolf Hess, also participated in interviews, maintaining her husband's innocence and loyalty to him until his death. Public statements made by these women varied widely in tone and content. Gudrun Himmler, Heinrich Himmler's daughter, remained an ardent defender of her father, making public statements that denied his involvement in war crimes. In contrast, other wives distanced themselves from their husbands' actions. Lena Heydrich, for example, while initially defensive of her husband's legacy, later made statements acknowledging the brutal realities of his actions. The perspectives these women held about their husbands' actions were often complex and multifaceted. Some, like Emmy Goering, expressed unwavering loyalty and admiration, painting their husbands as misunderstood or wrongly vilified. Others, such as Margarete Himmler, showed signs of conflicted emotions, torn between love for their spouse and the horror of their deeds. These memoirs, interviews, and public statements played a significant role in shaping public perception of these women. They provided a humanizing aspect to figures often demonized by association, while also revealing the depths of denial and complicity. The varied narratives highlighted the struggles these women faced in reconciling their personal lives with the public condemnation of their husbands' actions. In reflecting on their experiences, some of these women expressed regret and sought redemption, while others remained unrepentant. Their memoirs and public statements serve as historical documents, offering insights into the personal dimensions of the Nazi regime's collapse and the aftermath. They also illustrate the enduring impact of their husbands' legacies on their lives and their attempts to navigate a post-war world marked by profound loss and public scrutiny.